Good day and welcome to the last part of this tutorial series where we're going to learn how to render out our geometries that we've created throughout the tutorials that you've seen. So we're going to start with this cellular automata mesh right here. I'm just going to show you my approach on creating some nice lighting effects and applying materials that I think are suitable for this kind of geometry. Then we're going to move into this kind of hard surface modeling and hard surface rendering in this case. We're just going to look into how we can deal with different convex, concave corners and so on. And then we're going to move into this kind of large aggregation of triply periodic minimal surfaces, and we're going to look at what kind of lighting effects we can get, what kind of angles does this structure offer us. So just a quick note, for this large scale triply periodic minimal surface, what I did was I just increased the grid size as well as the step amount for game of life definition. It's absolutely the same technique that I used for the previous tutorial where we set up these geometries to be 3D printed. And what I've done for this is I haven't offsetted it, right? So this geometry right here is still a thin shell, meaning it doesn't have any thickness attached to it, and we don't really care about it. So we don't need thickness for something that we're not going to 3D print or CNC mill. For rendering, having no thickness is in most cases it's okay, as long as you're not dealing with transparent or refractive materials. But before we move into these two, let's start with the cellular automata mesh. So I'm going to select these and hide them. I'm going to zoom in to my cellular automata and just make a quick render out of it, just to see what we work with, what we're working with. Okay, so that's the render that we get. This is the default, like pure default presets for of Vray, meaning that we don't have any kind of direct light. All we have is this kind of scene backdrop or scene environmental light. So what I'm going to do is the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the light sources. Let me close this and open up Vray Asset Editor. So I'm going to go to my settings and I'm going to turn on interactive, so that every time I make changes, these get automatically re-rendered here in this window, right? And basically I'm going to go to Environment tab and turn off this kind of a bitmap that's used to light up the scene, right? So I'm going to turn this off. And now my scene turns completely black. That's because I don't have any light sources in it anymore, so of course everything renders out black. So what I'm going to do for my light sources, I'm going to use this rectangular light tool, and in the top view I'm just going to draw out these rectangles. Let's see, from here to here, something like this. And actually I'm going to draw out two of them, right? So let's just draw a second one from here to here. Immediately I can see that my element gets lit up, right, from the bottom up. That's these kind of lights at work. The next thing to do is to actually place them properly in the scene. So for this element I'm going to use a translucent material, meaning that the best way to light it up is behind One of them is my main source, while the other one is our secondary light source. So if I stop this, close that, I can simply take this rectangular light and rotate it around 90 degrees. Actually, let's keep it vertical. Rotate this around 90 degrees. Move it up here. Something like that. And I'll repeat the same thing for the other rectangular light. Something like this. For now, I'll make them a bit longer. It might change according to what I get from my test renders, but for now I'm just keeping them somewhat in the same proportion as my geometry. So let's say the angle at which I want to render is this, right? So that means that this rectangle right here, rectangular light right here, needs to be at 45 degrees. It needs to be placed somewhere here, right? Something like so. And actually, I'm going to make it slightly bigger. Oh. Let me use scale 1D to scale it up, something like that. So this is my main light source, right? And I'm going to tilt it slightly up. Or actually, before I do that, I'm just going to check how it renders without tilting it. So for the secondary light, I kind of want it to be on the opposite direction. It doesn't necessarily need to be, 180 degrees from my geometry. As long as it's, I'm just using it to color in the shadows to get some sort of control over whether or not the shadows are cold or warm. And so I have these two rectangle lights set up here. Let's just see how it renders out. All right. So this is way over bright and so on, but the basic idea is that, yeah, I have this kind of rectangular light, and then I have this kind of secondary light source that's shining right on one of the facades. Right? For now, this side is way too intense, so I'm going to fix that. I'm going to go to my Vray asset editor, and as I have this light selected, it's going to be highlighted here in the lights tab. So I'm going to change its intensity to something more like 10, something closer to 10. And my this is my secondary light, of course. So I'm going to change its color to be more bluish, right? Colder. And for my primary color, for my primary light source, I'm going to change the color to be more towards the orange side, right? And for both of them, one more thing is I'm going to make them invisible, right? So I don't want to see the light source, I just want to see the light from the light source. If I hit render again, I get this bluish tint, and from the back I get the orange tint, and that's exactly what I want. This will help me distinguish between the two light sources, right? Okay. So now on to the proportion of the render. Since I'm rendering out a column, it makes sense to have a render that's vertical rather than horizontal. So I'm going to go to settings, I'm going to go to render output, and instead of widescreen, I'm going to use portrait, right? You can also make a custom aspect ratio, but portrait for me works fine. And I'll turn on the save frame just to see what gets rendered out. Let me close these. let me zoom out and place my camera. Keep in mind that here in the bottom and here in the top, there are two small arrows that show that this view is being clipped, right? And that's absolutely fine. We'll just keep the interactive render on until we get some sort of a nice angle. Okay. Something like that seems fine. Let me stop the render. And I'm going to save this camera position by typing in named view, hitting save as, and I'll just call this cam1. Okay. And now every time when I, work around this geometry, I can simply right click on the name, set view, cam1, and it will bring me back to this particular camera position. So now what I want to do is I want some sort of a ground plane. So I'm going to go to Vray objects. Oh, that's not Vray objects. Basically, I want to create this kind of Vray infinite plane in the scene. So I'm just going to click on that icon right here, adds a infinite plane to the scene. And I'm going to scale it down. Since this is an infinite plane, it doesn't matter how big or small this icon is. This is just a representation of the alignment as well as the height where that infinite plane is placed, right? So I'm just going to place it somewhere slightly below my object. And at this point, let's just jump back to cam1, hit render. It renders out like so. So from the infinite plane, what I get is I get this kind of a light bleed, this kind of light reflection that will light up the bottom of my geometry. So let's stop the render, close that, and let's start adding in materials. For the bottom, I want the material to be quite dark, so I'll just use, let me just create a new one, generic material, and I'll call this dark plane, and I'll just give it a bit of darker diffuse. Never go full black or full white. If you need to have something very dark, try to be in like really dark grays rather than black, because black tends to eat up too much of the light. So we have the diffuse set to almost black, and I'll amp up the reflection a little bit to get some glossy effects. And maybe reflection glossiness should be something less, 0.9. This makes it so that the reflection becomes a bit blurry, as well as the highlights, of course. If I render this again, oh yeah, I kind of need to apply this to the plane. Apply to selection. Let's see. So it kind of renders out, but the problem right now is that the light gets reflected in my Vray infinite plane. So actually I'm going to, for reflection color, I'm going to turn this off. I don't want to deal with the reflections of the light. It's kind of easy to work around it by just in the light parameters making that the light doesn't affect reflections, but in this case I just want it not to affect the reflection of the plane, but to affect the reflections of this element, right? So it's just easier to turn off the reflections of the plane. Let me stop the render for now. So this seems fine. And then the last thing to do is I'm going to make this a bit bigger. Just gonna increase the size a little bit. Let's say 680 in height. And I'm going to apply, first I'm going to create and then apply a subsurface scattering material. So subsurface scattering is basically a material that's used for marble, skin, wax, and so on. And by default, it's it's set to be tonally something like wax or skin, and I'll have fun with it. So let's say the scatter color is somewhat, let's go for green, right, something like that. And the subsurface color is, let's go for blue. Well, blue completely kills it, so let's not go for full-on blue. Maybe something more in the grays. So I have green versus gray. Let's try a more intense green. And then here we have the scatter radius in centimeters, right? So we're modeling in millimeters, and here it's setting up in centimeters. For this basically to work properly, you need to keep rendering it and checking whether or not it works, whether or not the parameters work. I would suggest keeping the scatter radius as it is, as long as you're in, somewhat of a close scale to this, and rather changing the scale right here, right? So here you only touch the colors. As a beginner, you shouldn't play with too many handles. So I'm gonna hit render with Vray Interactive. Right. Apply the subsurface scattering to my geometry, and here I'm just gonna use a region render and just render out this portion right here. Right. All right, and from what I see here, this is almost good enough. The blue light that's shining here is being strengthened by the purple material that we have here, and the warm light from the back is being strengthened by the by the green color of our translucency. If I were to change the scale, and let me render out, let's see, this portion right here. If I were to change the scale to something like 0.5 or 0.1, let's go for 0.1 and render it again. You can see how drastic of an effect it is to the way the material behaves and lets the light through. If I were to change, let's say here, if I were to change the scale to be 10 and render this one out, this one starts becoming like the light starts bouncing in the shape so much that it's not registering the greens anymore, right? So there's always this kind of a sweet spot for these kind of renders, and in this case it seems like scale 1 worked perfectly, so I'm just going to render this one out. I'll pause the video and then I'll continue on once it's done. Alright, so it finished rendering out. I actually stopped it before it got to finish, so there's certain amount of noise still present, but this is basically the the view that you should expect with this kind of setup, and I think that aesthetically it looks really pleasing, and it's kind of interesting for this this kind of cellular automata structures to see all of the nooks and crannies of these geometries, right, and just investigate it in a sense of architectural space and so on, how it can be used. So that one was for the cellular automata geometry. Let me actually delete. I'll just delete it and I'll reset my I'll reset my scene to work with this geometry next, right? So for this one right here, the main thing is finding suitable architectural views, right? From which you could read this geometry as architecture. If I were to, you know, turn on the Rhino document sun and change the environment background to sky, where is it? To sky. Go back here, turn on the texture. If I were to do all of this and hit render, you know, a somewhat boring scene would be created. So rendering it from the back or from far away is not that great of an idea. Right now I'm going to change this to have an aspect ratio of, like this render, to have an aspect ratio of widescreen rather than portrait, because this guy right here probably fits better in widescreen widescreen render. And then again, for this one, I'm probably not going to create a Vray infinite plane. I'm just going to turn around and just see an angle which would work quite nicely compositionally speaking. Probably something like with this kind of repetitive geometry, there's a lot of light bleed. So I'm probably going to backlit this again instead of using the sun, because with the sun, if I hit render, turn the sun option, stop here. Also keep in mind that this geometry that you're going to bake out is really heavy, so it takes a while for it to get cached into Rhino, and it might start crashing quite a lot. Okay, we're back. It actually crashed my Rhino, so I had to restart, but it's basically, for now I'm just gonna set up, let me change this to wireframe view, maybe this is gonna be less heavy. I'm going to set up the sunlight, and I'm just going to check how it renders. So now I immediately can see that this is way over bright. I'm going to turn this down quite a bit. So in camera, under exposure value, I'm going to use something like 13. And even 13 is seems to be quite a lot, quite too much. So I'm going to first apply a generic material to my geometry, just to check whether or not the material itself has a large influence over how much light is being pushed through this kind of shape. So yeah, it seems like it was geometry. Right. So we have our light source and we have our secondary light from the environment. So it gets flushed with this kind of bluish tint. Let me see here, change the exposure settings. So we end up with something like this, right? Again, from this angle, this is this is not the best angle for this kind of structure. For me, rotating around this, I think having something from the top might be a pretty cool composition. So let's see here. Something like that. Let's render it out real quick. Oh yeah, this could actually work. So I'm going to play around with this a bit more. I'm going to turn off the Rhino document sign, and I'm going to turn off the background environment, just because I want a single light source that's coming from the bottom up towards the viewer. So in the top view, I'm just going to draw another rectangular light, like so. In the front view, I'll make sure that it's pointing in the correct direction. In this case, it's not, so I'll turn this around, and also I'll move this slightly down. So let me just rotate this around and move this slightly down so that it shines the light all the way through. Let's see in the top. Perhaps I'll just scale it up a little bit so that there's a full, so that I don't see that particular corner right here in my cam view. And speaking of views, I need to save this one. So I'm just going to type in named view, save as cam 2. That's my second view. And then I'm just simply gonna hit render. Okay. Immediately, you can see that the material is too dark, so no light is able to bleed through the material, as well as the camera settings are probably off. I'm going to go to my correction controls, and I'm going to turn on the exposure and just check if I play around with the exposure. Yeah, I'm losing quite a bit of geometry. Let me reset this, turn it off. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with the material, right? So I'm going to select it, go to Vray Asset Editor, and create a new material. And I guess we can use yeah, I guess we can use generic material for this, and I'm just going to call this aggregate. And the way I'm going to color this is not just with pure color, be it red or white or whatever. I'm going to color this with a texture, right? So that the color itself doesn't matter. I'm going to use a texture, so let me do that again. So I'm clicking on this checkerboard icon right here. And for the texture, I'm probably going to use something like fall off. So the way fall off works is it applies one color to things that you see, things that are perpendicular to your view. And it applies this different color to things that are parallel to your view, right? So if I have black and white, here in the preview you can kind of see it at work. Black is perpendicular to our view, white is parallel to our view, and everything in between gets blend together. So this will just strengthen the effect of the light bleed, because as the light is flowing through the surfaces, those are going to be parallel. Those surfaces are going to be parallel to our view, and the ones that are in the shadow are going to be perpendicular to our view. So this is just a nice little effect that emphasizes that particular light bleed. So I'm just going to apply this material to my geometry, right, like so. Apply to selection, and I'm going to change its parameters a little bit, the fall off parameters. So the color in the front should be, I guess let's do something with bluish tint, maybe grayish, bluish, something darker. And the color in the side, like pure white, is fine, but I'll probably use something more of a grayish, warmer color. Light gray should work, maybe a bit darker. Nothing else to change here. This is the material that I'm gonna use, so I'm just going to hit the render with Vray Interactive to just see if the material helps out at all. So it seems that the material works quite well. We managed to get some nice small details here and there, but the camera settings are still way off. So I'm going to go to my settings tab, and I'm gonna change the exposure value to something more like 11, and then I'm going to just use a region render to render out a portion of the geometry to just check whether or not I'm somewhere close. So after leaving it to render for a little bit, I can see that if I turn this off, first let me stop this and turn this off, I can see that increasing the or rather decreasing the exposure value of the camera managed to give me quite a lot of detail here. So I think now I'm almost ready to render out the final image. Before I do that, I'm going to close this off, and I'm going to add one last thing to this render, and that's going to be a render element, and I'm going to add what's called a ZDepth Map. So basically here in the render elements, I just choose to have a ZDepth Map. The way it works is all it needs is just the geometry, and it maps pixels from white to black depending on how far away that particular point in geometry is from the camera. And you can change the settings here by changing the near distance and the far distance. Before I'll start rendering and adjusting these two sliders right here, I'm going to go to my lights, and I'm going to turn off my V-Ray rectangle light, because ZDepth Map doesn't care for if there's any light in the scene. So I'm just I just turned off the rectangle light, which will make it so that the scene renders out much faster. Okay, and then I'll just hit render. So it's going to start rendering, and as you can see, this is completely black. So here in the top left corner, I have RGB colors set, and if I click on it, I can then choose to have ZDepth Map shown. And here the ZDepth Map seems to be completely black, meaning that I need to adjust my near and far distance. So for far distance, I'm going to use something more like let's do 1000, and let's see if that helps. Or maybe, yeah. So 1000 kind of helps. And my goal is to have the elements that are in front to be pure white, elements that are in the back to be pure black. So let's say the near distance is 500 and the far distance is 1000. or rather 1500. Let's see if that works. Seems to be pretty close. Elements here seem to be a bit gray. Let's try 1200. No, so 1500 seems to do the trick. Maybe instead of using 500, we can use something closer to 400. And that's my final values to get the ZDepth map, which we're later gonna use in Photoshop to get some sort of a fog effect or something like that. Let's stop the render for now. Jump back to RGB color. Turn on the light. Turn on the height of the image. In this case, for this tutorial, I'm just gonna do a 720p render, just to give you an idea. And then I'm gonna hit render, and I'll pause the video until it finishes. Okay, after leaving this to render for around 10 minutes or so, I can see that most of the detail is visible. It's still very low quality, very draft render, but this is good enough for me to give you guys an idea of, or an example of what you can achieve by using Vray for rendering these kind of structures. So here I'm just gonna save my beauty pass. So RGB color pass is also called the beauty pass. I'm gonna save it to my desktop. I'm just gonna call it 001, save. And then for ZDepth pass, I'm also gonna save it, desktop 001 ZDepth. I don't remember if it adds ZDepth by itself, so I'm just gonna add it just in case. Save those, open up Photoshop. I'll just show you how to arrange it in Photoshop so that you have this kind of nice fog effect. I'll just wait for Photoshop to open. Yeah. File, open. Let's open up those two. Open. There we go. And basically here I'm just going to take my ZDepth map, Control A, Control X to cut, Control V to paste as a separate layer, so I have like these two layers present. For this one, let's say everything here is fine. I might want to change the levels a little bit to increase the contrast of it, but basically here I don't want to change too much. Again, a very draft render, very noisy. If I left this for a few hours, it would be much cleaner. And here with the ZDepth map, what I want to do is I want to add some sort of fog effect so that we get a better sense of depth. So I'm going to create a new layer, and in that layer I'm going to go to filter, render clouds. I'm just going to render out these clouds right here, and I'm going to say that, well, I actually want to cut away the black parts of these clouds. So I'm going to make a mask like so. I'm going to copy, select the cloud layer, and I'm going to Control A, Control C. I'm going to copy that cloud layer, and then in the mask I'm going to go to channels, layer to mask. I'm just going to paste it. Oops, sorry. Enable the preview of it and then paste it like so. right? And then I can disable the preview of the mask, Control D, go back to layers. I have my clouds with the mask set up, right? Something like this seems kind of okay. So the thing now is that I want to have these clouds right back in the structure, so they shouldn't be floating above, but they should be in between the structure, and that's where ZDepth Map comes in handy. So I'm going to create this kind of group, and I'm going to place my cloud layer in that group, like so. And for this particular group, I'm going to add another mask, like so. And this one is going to be my ZDepth map. So I'm going to select it, Control A, Control C to copy it, Control D to unselect. I'm gonna go to my group, go to channels, and here group 1 mask, enable the preview of that, and just paste my my ZDepth map into this mask channel. Disable preview of that, go back to layers, Control D to check out what's going on. So the problem right now is that my clouds are actually being placed only on the things that are in front, and I want them to be placed on the things that are in the back. So I'm going to invert my mask by just selecting the ZDepth map right here, Control I to invert it, and now my clouds are being pushed in between the structure. Right? I can kind of use Control L, the layers or levels, to adjust, you know, how far away it's being pushed and how intense it gets. Something like this seems fine. Okay, so that's without clouds, and that's with clouds, right? Gives you a bit more three-dimensional information. And the last thing that I'd like to do with this image is to flatten this one out, merge layers, flatten it out, and then apply lens blur to it. So I'll just go to filter, blur gallery, iris blur. There's blur, and maybe my iris is tilted along, maybe my iris is tilted along the geometry, like together with the geometry, and maybe the blur is not as intense, maybe it's something like 10. And then the last thing is to increase the light bouquet effect to just get that like extra shine. So don't go overboard with this. This is, you know, this doesn't look that nice. But if you just add a little bit to it, it really makes a difference. Okay, something like that. I'll just use, I'll just enter to finish off my render, and this is the final render that I have. At this point I can just save it and call it a day. Okay, and now for the final, let me close this, go back to Rhino, close that. Well, I'll jump back to RGB color, close that. So back in Rhino, I'm going to delete this mesh and delete the surface right here, and I'm going to work with the final show selected. I'm going to work with the final hard surface geometry right here. So let's say in these tutorials we only worked with like soft surface, somewhat soft surface geometries, but just quickly, if you want to work with hard surface geometry, the thing is, like, for me the most convenient way to do it is to use blend materials. So in this case I'm just going to set up a regular Rhino document sun with some sunlight, Or maybe, yeah, instead of Rhino documents, and let's just set up a single rectangular light source, like so. Move it up, maybe rotate it without the ortho on, rotate it a little bit, like so. Perhaps a bit like so. Something like that. Move it a little bit back. Let's just see how it renders out. Okay, this is good enough of a render to test out our materials on. So I'm gonna close it. So again, with hard surface modeling, I tend to, well, if it's something simple, then it's just simple generic generic material. But if it's something more intense, I tend to use blend material, this one, with different coats and different bases and so on. So let's say we want to have some sort of a dirty, rusty element here that's flaking or something like that. For that, I need to first create a base material. Well, first I'm just gonna add a blend to this. Let me hide that for now. I'm just gonna add a blend material to this and render it out real quick. Also, it seems like the render size is a bit too much, because you have to wait for it to be set up. So I'm gonna use something like 480p. That's gonna be much faster. Still pretty slow though. Let me rotate around. That's strange. It doesn't seem to catch the material. It might be because the blend material doesn't have any materials applied to it. So I'm just going to give it a base material. I'm going to create a generic material. I'm going to call it base, and give it some sort of a, let's go for, so we did blue and green, we did red, and let's go for yellow. Oh, some sort of a intense yellow. I'm just gonna apply it here. So first, blend, base material, base. You can see immediately the blend material updates. Let's render it out. Here it is. So that's the yellow, just the yellow default color. Okay, so now let's say this is way too clean, right? I kind of want to have a bit of a shine on this. So I'm going to say, actually, my base should have a bit of reflection to it, and maybe the glossiness is like 0.95, something like that. So you know, I get these small highlights right here. So that's one. And then I'm going to, like before, I used to chamfer all of the edges, but it seems like in Rhino, now we have the ability to go to options, edge softening, and we can soften the edge a little bit, right? Like so. So let's say if I soften the edge, that's 0.1 millimeters. Let's go for 1 millimeter. Render it out. It doesn't seem to change much, but from time to time these small highlights will start appearing where it catches the light in just that perfect angle. Okay. Now this material is slightly shiny. Let's do creating some grain. for it. So in blend material, I'm gonna add a coat, right? And my coat material is going to be, let's say it's metal, right? So I'm just going to create a generic material. Let's go for black diffuse, full reflection, reflection glossiness point, let's go 0.6, something like that. And in refraction, index of refraction, let's go for 20 or something like that. Well, 20 is, let's go for 15. Okay, so we get this kind of aluminum, brushed aluminum look for our material. This is definitely not the correct way, I think, to create this kind of a glossy, metal-y effect, but it works for me. So I'm going to say metal, and I'm going to change the blend coat 1 material to be metal. So right now it's going to, the way it's going to act is it's going to be 50% metal, 50% yellow. And that's not what we want. We want to have metal flakes just in some parts and not all over the place. So I'm going to add this kind of blend texture. And for me to check where that blend texture should be placed, I'm going to actually create this kind of emissive material right here, apply it to my geometry, so that, and for the emissive material, I'm going to use a texture that I'm later on gonna reuse in my blend. This makes it so that it's easier for me to see where my material is going to be placed when the texture is actually shining light. So I'm going to select edges here because I want my metal to be right on the edges. Width, let's go for, let's try 10. I have no idea what's the scale of this thing. Actually, it would be a good idea to just check. Let's say between those 2 points. Distance from here to here, 4 millimeters. So let's go for 3 millimeters here. Edges color black, background color white. Let's turn these around. Go back here and let's apply that emissive material to our geometry and render it out. Just make a test render. So this is way too thick. Let's fix it. Go back here, point to something closer to that. Oh yeah, this is much better. Okay. So we end up with having these edges all over the place. The problem with it is that it also kind of renders out the flat edges as well. So that's pretty bad. But I think if we change this to concave only, or sorry, convex only, that might solve it. Let's re-render. Nope, doesn't do anything. So let's do plan B. Instead of edges, let me clear this. Instead of edges, let's use, let's try using dirt material and see if that helps out. So dirt, let's just see how it renders out right now. So everything's white except the inner corners. This is exactly how the dirt material works. Let me invert this, render this one out again. So this is where that material is being placed. This is much better. So for color, I'm going to choose the radius to be like, let's go even more, let's go 50, something like that, maybe even more. 80. Okay, let's go full 100. So I end up with something like this. Distribution, I'll probably do something like, yeah, full distribution of 10, something like that. Don't remember, sorry, I don't remember what fall off does, but it's basically, right now I want to have as much contrast as I possibly can. Okay, so you can go only as far with radius and distribution. You will end up with gradients all over the place either way. So I'm going to say actually 250, something like this seems fine. Let me invert the colors again to something like this. And then I'm going to copy my, let me stop the render. I'm going to copy my, or cut my emissive material, and actually I'm going to use what's called color correction material, and in it I'm going to paste my dirt map, because right now, as I have my dirt map as my color input, I can add more contrast, like so. Let's see how it renders out. Let me invert the colors again. So this is with contrast set to 2. Right, let's set it to 5, maybe 10. We end up with something like this, right? Very high contrast geometry. And basically playing around with these different parameters gives you different results and so on. So just play around with these until you get, until you get what you want. For now, I think this is fine. I'm gonna say that here, actually, all of my paint is flicking off, right? In these nooks and crannies. So I'm going to actually let's increase the radius a little bit. Let's say 30 or 50, something like that. Yeah. So in this portion, my paint is flicking off. So right now it's gonna be very uniform if I try it this way. So I'm going to also let me increase the contrast even further. I'm going to apply, instead of using pure white color, I'm going to apply this kind of a chipped map on top of it. So let me go for where was it? Leather, cloth, noise, cellular. Okay, let's try cellular for now. Cellular size 0. Let's go for 0.1. We'll arrange them accordingly to what we get as we start rendering it. Type should be probably chips. Let's try chips, something like this. And color edge, I'll just go for probably something like pure black here. Let's try something like this. Density, let's decrease it a little bit to something like this, I guess. So let's try. I'm going to go back here, hit render again. Check out the texture. It seems to be a bit too too big. Actually, it's way too big. So let me go back here, or sorry, way too small. So let me go back here and increase the size to something like 1. Let's try 0.7. Yeah, this seems to do the trick. Okay, and this is our basically our blend texture that we're gonna use for the metal. So now, once I have this set up, I can actually take this texture, copy it, and go to my blend and paste it in as my blend texture. So here you can see like small spots appearing and so on, but the cool thing is gonna happen once we start rendering out our geometry. Here. Let me just quickly focus up on some parts. And here you can see that that kind of metal texture starts appearing. And this is way too little from what I wanted. So I'm going to increase in the blend texture. I'm going to adjust it even further. So I'm going to increase the radius from 50 to 200, distribution to 10, something like that. Let's try this again. You can see here these kind of metal flakes start appearing, and that's what I did, right? So now let's continue on adding some more coats to this. First one being there should be some dirt on top of this, right? So I'm going to, well, even before I add the dirt coat, I'm gonna say that as it's reflecting light, it should change the color a little bit. So I'm going to add another coat. I'm gonna add a material that's, let's say, generic. I'm gonna say reflected color, and change the diffuse to be somewhere closer to the reds, maybe even darker red. And here in the blend, I'm just going to, actually I'm gonna change this to fabric preview, and in the blend I'm just going to change my my coat 2 material to be reflected color, right? And for the blend, I'm going to use, for the blend texture, I'm going to use fall off texture, right? So as we're looking at our geometry from the front, it's gonna be yellow. As we're looking at it from the side, it's gonna get this kind of dark brownish shine to it. I'm gonna add another coat. And this one is just gonna be dirt, so I'm just gonna create a generic material for now, call this dirt, and make it pretty dark, almost black. And I'm gonna go to my blend material and apply this dirt. And for the blend, I'm also gonna use dirt. So the radius in this case, let's try using 10, just to see how it works. So right now this is inverted, so I'm gonna use so I'm just going to invert my unoccluded colors, like so. So in the nooks there is this kind of a dirt texture applied, and actually this is gonna mess with our metal flakes, but that's absolutely fine. So let's just see how it renders out. And at this point, I'm pretty satisfied with the way this geometry looks like. Of course, adding more coats with more metal flakes, maybe some irregularities of the material and so on would give it a nicer texture. But this is good enough for this kind of a introductory tutorial. So I'm just going to find a normal camera angle, and also I'll just make a quick secondary light. Let's see, something like so, and it's shining from the bottom up. Let's try something like that. So secondary light. Let's just quickly render this to see. Yeah, doesn't make sense to have it here, so let me just delete the secondary light and instead use the main one, just the main one, sorry. And for the camera angle, let's try something like this. Maybe I'll make a copy of it just to fill in the space. Maybe rotate it 90 degrees, place it somewhere here, move vertical from here to here. Add another copy. Maybe this one is rotated 45 degrees sideways. Oops. There we go. Something like that. So let's just find a decent composition of all of these. This one is a bit lower. Also lower. Okay, so let's try rendering this one out. So the render is halfway complete. I've just stopped it. It's been around half an hour on my laptop, so it's still a pretty noisy render, but you can get a sense of what I'm aiming towards and what kind of qualities I get from this kind of material. So here you can see some interesting flaking effects, and some dirt maps appear here. You can see there's a this kind of red coat that's only being shown on surfaces that are quite parallel to our view. The more parallel it is, the more red it becomes. So we get this kind of a stronger three-dimensionality to our structure, as well as in some parts, especially the shaded parts. Oops. In shaded parts, more flaking appears. This kind of gradient right here is still too soft, so I would go back and I would change the contrast of the dirt map and so on. I would add more coats to it, play around with the different options, but this is like the first pass on the render, just to get just to give you guys an idea of what can be achieved with this kind of blend. Hard surface modeling. Again, I would probably, not probably, but I would go into the model, or rather the material, and adjust quite a few probably rearrange them so that the dirt falls and so on, and maybe I would add a few more, remove a few, change a few, but first pass, I think this is good enough. Also, when dealing with these kind of older, like trying to weather the material, adding irregularities to the base material as well as the reflected color material gives really nice effects, especially like these kind of blotches or bubbles in the paint that's too old. That can be easily achieved with a bump map, but for now this is good enough. And this concludes our tutorial series. So with this video I've showed you like 3 different ways or 3 different geometries and ways how I would treat them. Of course there's always this library of materials that you can work with. If you need concrete, you just slap on the concrete from them, but I think creating your own is much more fun and much more experimental, and you learn the tool much faster when you work with your own materials. So I encourage experimenting with that and maybe finding some cool effects that I haven't suggested here. And that's it. Thanks for watching.